Constantine, a Hellblazer podcast.
Hey there, everybody, and welcome back to John Constantine, a Hellblazer podcast. Today, we are reading Hellblazer issue 164. But just a little catch up on what's been going on. In the last couple issues, we had a two-part story arc where we learned a bit about John's past, and we got to see a con that John pulled with his friends Chaz and Gary Lester, where some American guy named Stanley hired them to steal Rasputin's clock for a large sum of money, and they ended up just giving him a fake clock, but he didn't know that, and they made it look like some guy named the Arab was the person that John stole it from, and he came and killed all of them, and Stanley barely got out alive, and so I guess he thinks that he actually has Rasputin's clock, at least for a while, and John and Chaz and Gary got a bunch of money. But in the background of that comic, we saw a woman named Angie who was like a John Constantine groupie, we'll say. She was really into him, he wasn't so much into her, and she had found the Book of Destiny, which if you say someone's name to it, the pages inside of it would fill with that person's entire life story, and you could read what happens to them in the future. So Angie, of course, being a big fan of John, decides to read his story, and by the end of it, she is very appalled and thinks he's a horrible person, but unfortunately, there was some stuff in there about the owner of that book, who is named Destiny as well, is one of the Endless from the Sandman comic books. So Destiny confronts Angie after she finishes John's story, and apparently Destiny plays some part in John's life, and he doesn't want anybody to know about that. So he actually killed Angie and took his book and left, and that's where we left off in the last issue. And the only thing that really tied into the storyline that's been going on in that little story arc was that John is in Montana at the beginning of that story arc, so we can see he's gone from the south kind of to the northwest. And he's going that way because he's looking for a town called Highwater, which is where Agent Frank Turo told John to go. So first things first, with issue 164, we got the cover. There's not really any context for what's going on. There are 6 panels over a red background. In 4 of those panels, we see some people that look like they might be kind of heavy hitters for some biker gang or something. Then in one of the last 2, we see John, who is just smoking like always and kind of looking out at us. And the final panel on this page is something that I've never seen before. I don't know if this is a real symbol or not, but there is a modified swastika on the cover. I've never seen this particular design, and it's kind of so subtle, I never really noticed that it was a swastika until just now looking at it. And the symbol is 4 crosses that are touching at their base, so they're coming to a kind of X pattern, but the tops of them are obviously the arms of the cross, and coming from the center of where they touch at their base, all the way to the arms, there's a thin white line, and that white line extends only into the left side of the cross. So that is where the swastika comes in, because just adding that one white line that comes out in the left side of the cross makes a subtle swastika. But even though I didn't notice that before, just from the feel of the cover, you can tell that this is some kind of either evil symbol or racist symbol. And also on the cover, we see that this is written by Brian Azzarello with art by Marcelo Fruscian. And as we turn to the first page, we see a very beautiful landscape where there's like an ocean, and it's kind of coming into a cove where there's all these pine trees, and we see some waterfalls. And I had to look this up because they never say where this is, but John has apparently continued his trek northwest from Montana, and he is somewhere around either Washington or Oregon, somewhere in that kind of northwest region of the United States. And over these panels of a picturesque wilderness landscape, we get some narration that says, God breathed life into Adam, meaning he gave him a divine spirit, which separated him from all creation, meaning he was special to God. The name Adam means to show blood in the face, meaning he could blush, meaning he was white. Then we turn the page, and we see inside of a small town, there is a man walking in a trench coat. Obviously, this is John, but he's just walking down the streets, and everybody's kind of looking at him, basically like he doesn't belong. And over these panels, the narration continues, But Eve, she was tempted by Satan, in human-like form, not as a snake, but as a penis, meaning she laid down with a man other than Adam, meaning the fall from grace was not only sexual in nature, and Adam, he partook in the fruit as well, and it was pleasant to the eyes and capable of making men wise. But this earthly knowledge, the cost was high, and the knowing was painful, meaning the seed of Satan had been planted. And right as this last line is said, we get a full-page splash of John walking into a place called Highwater Tap, which we can assume is a bar. And we also see the name of this issue is Highwater Part 1. So John has finally made it to the town of Highwater, which was where Frank Turro told him to go. And as John walks into the bar, we see some other patrons at the pool table, and they look up at him and they don't look very pleased. And all of them are white, and all of them have some sort of Nazi iconography on them, whether it be tattoos or patches on their jackets. And the main guy we can see, because everybody else is kind of in shadow a bit, is leaning over the pool table, and he has a forehead tattoo that says War Skin. And he has a very large swastika tattooed on his arm. And I should say all these guys look like they're in their 20s. So they watch John approach the bar, and John talks to the bartender saying, "Hello." And the bartender says, "Hey." And John says, "I'd like a whiskey." And the bartender says, "We don't got Irish whiskey." And John kind of smiles and pulls out a cigarette and says, "How about a Kentucky bourbon then?" And I'm assuming the bartender said that because he thought John was Irish because of his accent. So he pours John a glass of bourbon, and John says, "Cheers." And then the bartender turns his back, and John continues saying, "Say, Squire, was wondering if you could help me." And the bartender turns back around as John lights his cigarette, and he says, "What makes you think I can?" And John answers, "Well, I found if I need something, usually a bloke on that side of the bar can give it to me. I'm looking for this bird, Marjorie Furman. You know her?" And if you don't remember who that is, I don't think they ever said her first name, but the guy that John went to prison for at the beginning of the Azzarello arc was named Lucky Furman, and he was the brother of Richie and Dickie Furman, who we met in the second arc of Brian Azzarello's run. So the bartender just stares at John for a second and says, "Do I know you?" And John answers, "No." And the bartender replies, "Right." So I guess that means, he's not going to tell John anything because he doesn't know him. And before John can say anything else, the bartender turns to the guys at the pool table and yells, "Jimmy?" And the 5 neo-Nazi guys surround John at the bar as John just sits there kind of casually. And the man directly behind John is the guy with that war skin tattoo on his forehead, and he also has a scar down the front of his face that goes from the right side of his nose, past the right side of his mouth, and down his chin. And he says to John, "Why you looking for Marjorie for?" And John doesn't turn around, but he's staring at them in the mirror, and he says, "I was mates with her husband." And the guy next to Jimmy asks him, "He got killed, didn't he?" And John answers, "'S right. And I got put in prison for doing it." And Jimmy says, "That still don't answer my question." And then John stands up and turns around and looks straight at him and says, "I'd say it does." And then Jimmy locks eyes with John and says, "You don't look like no killer." And John replies, "Neither do you. That put us on the same page?" And Jimmy, still stone-faced, looks at John hard, and then he says, "Yeah." And then he points outside and says, "Take this road about a half mile or so that way. Oakton's on the left, 726, big house. You can't miss it." And then John stamps out his cigarette in an ashtray and says, "Thanks." And then he walks over to the door to exit, and as he puts his hand on the handle, Jimmy says, "Hey, sorry for the attitude, brother. You looked federal." And John says, "Me? Must be the coat." And then he turns around and Jimmy says, "Yeah, we got a thing about outsiders." And John asks, "Meaning?" And Jimmy answers, "We don't trust them." And with that, John leaves the bar and walks out, and he says to himself, "You shouldn't." And as Jimmy watches John walk down the street, one of the other guys asks him, "You want I should follow him?" And Jimmy answers, "For what, Kyle?" And Kyle says, "To see what he's up to." And we get a good panel after this that shows Kyle and Jimmy are wearing just regular kind of like white t-shirts and some olive green army pants and some military style boots. And the 3 guys behind them are wearing leather jackets over that same ensemble, but their jackets have a patch around their left arm that looks like the symbol from the front cover. And they're kind of standing at attention, and I don't know, it just looks like they're the followers and maybe Jimmy and Kyle are above them in this white nationalist gang they're in. And one of those three guys in leather jackets says, "He ain't up to shit." And Jimmy says, "Yeah, you heard him. He's a righteous dude." And then Kyle says, "I heard him all right. Said he wasted Marjorie's old man. What if he's got the same in mind for her?" And Jimmy answers, "If he does, she must deserve it." "What time is it, Mike?" And the bartender answers, 8:30. And Jimmy asks, "Bar time?" And Mike answers, "Real time." And then Jimmy turns to his guys and says, "I got a motor." And then he looks at one of the other guys and asks, "We all set with the Wolfman tomorrow, Rex?" And Rex answers, "Yeah, I talked to him today. Says he'll be rolling in after dark." And Jimmy asks, "Mr. Gage know?" And Rex answers, "Yep. You're supposed to pick up the cash in the morning." And with that, Jimmy turns and he leaves the bar, and one of the guys calls after him, "You take care, Jimmy." And without turning back, Jimmy says, "Later, brother." And as Kyle watches Jimmy walk away, he says, "I still think we should follow that English guy." And as they're standing in front of the window, we're seeing the sun kind of go down, so it turns to nighttime as John is walking down the road in the direction that Jimmy told him to go. And over those panels, we get the narration continuing from the beginning, where someone is translating the Bible, and they're saying, "The seed of Satan had been planted, meaning that, in the original act of sin, the satanic race was born, meaning that Eve had conceived a child of Satan as well as Adam, Cain and Abel, twin sons of different fathers, meaning only Abel carried Adam's bloodline, which was righteous and pure, and Cain, he could find no favor with God, meaning God scorned him, for he saw Cain for what he truly was, a mongrel." And we see John is walking on a road that's labeled Oakton, and he's going to a house that says 726, which is the directions that Jimmy gave him. And over these panels, the narration continues saying, "So in the first act of jealousy, Cain murdered Abel, spilling his pure blood, and God cast Cain out of the garden, meaning he was forced to roam the land, and he was bearing a mark, meaning that he was physically different, meaning he was the first Jew, meaning that he was the father of an evil race dedicated to the destruction of the pure white bloodline of Adam." And as John's walking up to the house, before he gets to the porch, he stops and he pulls out his cigarette pack and he gets one ready to light. And he looks over and he sees the ghost of Lucky Furman, who we saw one other time when he was in prison and John was kind of being haunted by his ghosts. But if you don't remember what he looked like, basically he's your average white guy, except he died from shooting himself in the head. So his whole lower jaw is blown off and he's constantly bleeding from that, and there's saliva dripping out, and there's a big hole on the top of his head, and he can't speak, so he has to use a notepad to talk to John. And as John sees him, he says, "Hey, was wondering when I might see you again. Cigarette?" And Lucky doesn't say anything, he just kind of looks at John. So John just shoves his cigarette into the gaping hole that was Lucky's mouth, and he continues asking, "So how goes the afterlife, Lucky?" And Lucky writes something on his pad of paper, and when he shows it to John, we can see that it says aches. And John says, "Course it does." And then John gets his lighter out and he lights Lucky's cigarette, and he asks, "Were you expecting anything else?" And then Lucky writes something else down and he shows it to John, and it says, "Dickie says hello." And then John says, "About that." But then Lucky kind of cuts him off because he begins writing again, and he shows it to John and it says, "You've got a lot of folks waiting for you." And John reads it and then he says, "Well, they'll just have to sit tight, won't they? See, I've got other mates at hand. Speaking of which, this is quite a house. Looks like your missus done all right by herself. Make you feel like you was holding her back?" And then Lucky begins to write again, and he holds the paper up to John and it says, "Help her, John." And John asks, "With what?" And then Lucky writes something else down and shows John the notepad, and he has drawn a swastika. And John says, "You mean the silly winkers playing dress up in town?" And then Lucky writes something else and shows John, and it says, "Just a symptom." And John asks, "So what's the disease then?" And Lucky writes again, and it says, "Hate disguised." And John asks, As what? And Lucky writes again, and it says, the Bible. And John kind of scoffs at that and says, disguised. Afraid not, sunshine. The so-called gospel truth is wide fucking open to interpretation, meaning every git, and they are legion, that puts any credence in the good book can look to it as divine justification for their bloody earthbound agendas. And as John's been talking to Lucky, he's been walking away from the house, so he's a little bit closer to the woods, and we cut to inside some bushes where we see Kyle and some of the other men watching John, and Kyle says to the other man, he's a fucking nut job, eh? Because, of course, they don't see the ghost of Lucky, they just see John talking to himself. And the guy that's with Kyle asks, what do you think he's doing? And Kyle answers, I don't know. Maybe he's rehearsing what he's got to say to Marjorie. And the guy with Kyle kind of laughs and says, loser. Then we turn the page and we cut to Jimmy walking into his house, and he goes to his living room where we see his wife has fallen asleep while she's been watching TV, and he kind of pets her head and smiles at her. Then he walks into another room, and that room looks to be their bedroom, but there's also a baby's crib in there. And as he is walking in, we see Jimmy take off his shirt, and he has a big iron eagle tattooed on his back that's sitting on a swastika. And all around his room are different types of Nazi flags and Nazi memorabilia. And one of the flags is the symbol that we saw on the cover. And over these panels, we're getting the narration of someone interpreting the Bible, and they're continuing to say, the pure white bloodline of Adam was dear to God. But as they grew in number, again and again, the sin of Eve was committed, meaning the race was further mongrelized, meaning they violated God's law. And this angered God, for he had created the white race to be special to him, not to be swallowed up and polluted through the intermarriage with the darker races. So God instructed Noah, a just man pure in his generations, meaning racially pure, to build an ark. Then we see Jimmy reach into the crib and pull out his baby, and he kisses the baby on the forehead, and as he brings the baby out into the living room, he's looking very attendant and sweet towards this baby, and then his wife wakes up and sees him holding his baby, and she smiles, and then he sits down on the couch with her, and all three of them watch some TV. And over these panels, the narration continues saying, and God flooded the lands held by the sinners and their mongrel offspring, meaning he cleansed the earth of all that offended his eye. When the flood had subsided, God then told Noah and his wife and their children, be fruitful and multiply, meaning populate the world, restoring the racial purity and the integrity of the white race, his chosen people. And I gotta say that these couple pages of Jimmy at his house is very interesting because it's a weird juxtaposition. It's kind of odd to see a Nazi man going home and kissing his wife, and you can tell that he really loves her, and then picking up his baby, and he looks like he's a good father, but that's all in this horrible context of, one, he's a Nazi, and two, all the Nazi memorabilia and iconography around the house. And then, of course, we're hearing what this woman is saying in the narration over that, which also colors it. So it's a pretty interesting couple of pages. Then we turn the page, and we cut to John knocking on the front door of Marjorie's house, and she opens the door, and she looks like a white lady in her early 30s, and she has kind of short blonde hair, and she's wearing a pink dress. And when she sees John, she says, oh my. And John looks at her kind of sad and says, hello, Marjorie. And then she begins to tear up, and John looks even more sad. And then as she cries, she says, John. And then John gives her a big hug, and we're left with them hugging on the porch. Then we turn the page, and we cut to a different house, and we see an older man inside the house, and he's listening to a young woman read from the Bible. And this is the woman who's been narrating this whole issue. So she's the one who's been kind of interpreting the Bible to him. And over the pages where we just see the outside of the house, her narration continues saying, and God made a covenant with his chosen people. He gave them strength and the straightness of character, for he loved them more than all his creation, meaning that he had created everything for them. They were to conquer the wilderness, multiply into great numbers, and settle in a land promised to them, a beautiful, bountiful land of great agricultural and mineral wealth, meaning the greatest nation on earth, meaning America. And the older man who's listening to this is dressed in all khakis, almost like he's in a military uniform, but there is no insignias or anything. He's of course a white guy, and he has a short buzz cut, and he says to the girl, "I'm proud of you, you know that?" And she kind of smiles bashfully, and he says, "Tell me, Gwyneth, what happened to our promised land?" And she answers, "It was taken from us in 1865. And the man says, "That's right, by the most evil, most vile, most corrupt government on the face of the earth, the United States government, Zog, the Zionist occupational government. And what do these liars, these vipers, these demon seeds who cannot hear the word of God because he speaks only the truth, and as children of Satan, the truth is not in them, what do they seek to do?" And the young woman replies, "Rule the world, but we can't let them, Daddy." And then he reaches out and he touches her face, and he's standing above her, so it looks kind of creepy, and he says, "No, baby, we can't." And then he pulls her up to give her a hug, but they're silhouetted in a window when he does this, and it looks really creepy, like it's supposed to be some kind of romantic image, because he's looking down at her and she's looking up at him, and their silhouettes are joined at the hips. And with that creepy image, that is the end of the issue. So if you guys have any comments, questions, or suggestions, you can email me at planestrains and comicbooks, all one word, @gmail.com, and we will see you on the next one.